Last week, a youth group asked me to conduct a Bible study on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, I am always excited to be conducting a Bible study. So, inspired by the early church fathers, we decided to take the typological approach. In fact, that is the way that Jesus taught his disciples on the way to Emmaus. Now, I hope that this Bible study makes you fall in love with Jesus for one, but also makes you fall in love with Bible study. Sit back, relax, enjoy. Anthropologist Margaret Mead was once asked by one of her students what she thought was the first sign of human civilization. Now, the answer that they expected was the discovery of the wheel, or the discovery of the fishing hook, or the understanding of how to use fire. But Margaret Mead said this. She said, when the human broke its femur, that is the thigh bone, and actually recovered, was the first sign of human civilization. Why? Generally in the animal kingdom, when an animal broke the femur or the thigh bone, they would never recover because they couldn't go and fetch food, because they couldn't go to the river to drink water. In fact, they couldn't even protect themselves from other wild animals or from nature. And generally, when the femur was broken of an animal, the animal landed up dying. But when it comes to human beings, when the human being recovered, it meant that someone has taken the time to stay back with the one who fell. That someone has stayed back with the person to bind the wound, to take care of the wound. Someone has carried the person to safety and has tended the person throughout the period of recovery. What she actually said was, the ability of the human being to show compassion is the beginning of human civilization. The parable that we are going to discuss today is a parable of compassion, is a parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, this is how we are going to do it. I'm going to read through the entire passage once, and we're going to pick up certain nuances from the passage which I would like to explain to you. And then I'm going to do that pretty quickly. And then we are going to go to the interpretation of the early church fathers. Now, when I read what the early church fathers, or how the early church fathers interpreted this passage, my mind was blown. It's beautiful. So let's dive straight into it. So in the start, in Luke chapter 10, a lawyer comes to Jesus. Now, he is not there because he wants to learn. He's there more because he wants to test or maybe trap Jesus. And he asks this question, Lord, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Or teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now Jesus says to him, what do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, this man answered beautifully, and Jesus says that to him. He says, and he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. And now the lawyer is not satisfied. He actually came to trap Jesus. So he says to Jesus, who is my neighbor? And that today is the $1 million question, who is my neighbor? Traditionally, for the Jews, the neighbor was a member of the same social class, the same religious group, the same ethnic group, a relative, maybe the person who stayed next door. But that was not the answer that Jesus was going to give him. He expected that answer, but that was not the answer that Jesus was going to give him. In fact, Jesus gives him after this the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, the parable goes like this. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, some important things to note here. Firstly, that the man was going down. Why downwards? Because Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho is about 770 feet below sea level. Now, Josephus, the historian, tells us that the distance between Jerusalem and Jericho was about 18 miles. And the road was a rocky road, a deserted road through the country. It was steep, it was treacherous, and there were many places for thieves and bandits to hide. In fact, the name of the road back then was called the Way of Blood, and therefore this entire parable is very believable for those who are listening to Jesus. Okay, the parable continues. And fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. Now they stripped him of his clothes, they possibly stripped him of all the things that he had, his animal, his other possessions. They beat him up, left him unconscious, and that possibly explains why he looked like a corpse. He was not dead, but he looked as if he was dead. And the Old Testament, there is a pretty strict policy of touching dead bodies. Generally, they believe that if you touch a dead body, you become ritually unclean and you are unable to go to the temple. And then we continue, we see, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by the other side. Who is the priest? In the Old Testament, the priest was one who was serving in the Jerusalem temple. The priest performed sacrifices and maintained the temple. They provided instructions to the people. They were in charge of the sacrifice. They were the ones who did the main sacrifice in the temple. So likewise, the Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. Now who is the Levite? A Levite in the Old Testament was commonly used for a descendant of Jacob. A Levite was entrusted with minor responsibilities and services related to the temple cult and to other rites in the temple. They were in a sense assistants to the priest of the temple. Their status actually varied through the course of history. Now why would a Levi and a priest not help? It helps to understand the culture. Generally, the Levi and the priest served in the temple, and coming in contact with the dead body actually meant that they could not serve in the temple for another 7 days. They were ritually unclean. Were they excused from helping this person? Absolutely not. Why? One, because they have finished their temple responsibilities and they were going away. They were going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and they were going away. So there was no reason for them not to help, but they didn't help. And then comes in the hero of the story. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. Now who is a Samaritan? The Samaritans are people of mixed Israelite and foreign descent. Thus, the Jewish people did not accept them as part of the Jewish community. Now they were considered to be an inferior race in the Jewish mind. The Jews, in fact, considered the Samaritans to be even less than human. This was the social structure. Right at the center were the priests, then the Levites, then the Jews, then the tax collectors, the outcast and the sinners, and then the Samaritans, and then the Gentiles. The Samaritans were considered even worse than the tax collectors, or even worse than the worst of the worst sinners. They were worse than the outcast. And therefore it was unimaginable for the listeners to believe that a Samaritan would actually help a Jew because of the way the Samaritans were treated by the Jews, because of the enmity between the Samaritans and the enmity between the Jews. The Jews, if they had to go to a particular place and they knew that Samaritans stayed there, they wouldn't even travel through that town or through that place. They would go all around. And that is how much the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. Then what happens? He went to him and bandaged his wounds, and having poured oil and wine on them, then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper. Take care of him, and when I have come back, I will repay you whatever more you have spent. Let's come back to the oil and the wine. The oil and the wine were a favorite application for wounds in ancient medicine. It was considered a great remedy, especially for wounds produced by violence. Now, the wine was supposed to act as a cleanser, and the olive oil was supposed to soothe and heal. Often it was also made into a compound and used for medicine. Okay, now right that we've gone through this entire passage, let's understand the typological meaning of this passage, the way the early church fathers interpreted it. The entire parable of the Good Samaritan is a very interesting metaphor of the journey of humankind, of the human race from Jerusalem to Jericho, and how we are lost on our way and how God comes and brings us back to the heavenly city of Jerusalem. In this parable, Jerusalem can mean the original state of peace and innocence that God meant us to be. And what is Jericho? Jericho is the state of trouble and sin. The human race has rejected God and has left Jerusalem and is on its way to Jericho. And what happens on the way? The human race comes across thieves and bandits and robbers. Now, thieves and bandits and robbers could be understood as sin. And what has sin done? Sin has despoiled the humankind of its robe of innocence and all its supernatural gifts, and has grievously wounded you, and has grievously wounded me, and has grievously wounded our natural gifts, the gifts of peace, the gifts of joy, and more importantly, the gift of a union with God. Sometimes I think of the Jewish man who lay down by the road. He's unable, he's weak, he's unable to help himself. And the very same way it is you and I, the human race, lay wounded and lay weak and lay hopeless, unable to raise ourselves from the misery of sin, no matter how much effort we actually put in. If you've known anybody who struggled with an addiction, who struggled with the temptation, if you've struggled with addictions and temptations, then you know the difficulty, you know the almost impossibility of picking yourself up from this situation. And we see, the human race exactly in this situation, unable to lift itself up from the misery. And what did the human race need? We needed the help of another, one who is not injured, and the one who can heal our wounds. And just like this man, I'm sure he lay down there by the side. He saw the priest go by. He saw the Levi go by. And he would have put his hope, he would have put his wish that they would come and help him. The priest and the Levi, in a certain sense, signify the sacrifices and the laws of the old covenant. And no matter how good they are, they cannot save. In the same way, we turn to our culture, we turn to its hopes, we turn to its promises, but only to realize that even though it is good, it cannot help us, it cannot save us, it cannot heal our wounds. They are only made, or they only make us realize more fully how helpless we actually are, or how helpless our condition truly is. And what happens next? The Son of God, moved by compassion, came down from heaven to help the poor fallen human race. This human race that was living at enmity with God. We had distanced ourselves from Him, but God, who for us is foreign and distant, has set out to take care of His wounded children. Christ has now become the Good Samaritan. Christ has now become the good neighbor. What does Samaritan man do? He heals the wounds with wine and with oil. And what does wine stand for? Wine stands for the blood of Christ. And what does oil stand for? Oil stands for the grace of Christ. And you put these two together, you put the blood of Christ, the grace of Christ together, and we see the healing that God has provided to us, that Christ has provided for us in His sacraments. Next, the Samaritan man picks him up and puts the Jewish man on his animal, on his beast. And the beast stands for the humanity of Jesus Christ. He puts our sin on Himself and carries it until He can bring us to a place of healing, until He can bring us to the inn. And what is the inn? The inn is His church. And who are the innkeepers? The innkeepers are the guardians of His church. He gives 2 pieces of silver to the innkeeper. And what are the 2 pieces of silver? His doctrine and His grace. And why does He give the doctrine and the grace to the innkeepers? He gives the doctrine and the grace to the innkeepers that they may tend to His people, that He may tend to this weak flock, that He may tend to His wounded flock. Pope Francis very often says the church is a field hospital. Now notice that a field hospital is not a place where people come to beautify themselves. Rather, a field hospital is a place for those who are grievously injured, for those who are on the verge of death. And what does Christ provide for His people in this field hospital? He provides His grace and He provides His doctrine that it may bring healing. And then the Good Samaritan tells the innkeeper, I shall reimburse you when I come back. What does that mean? It just means that until Christ comes back, it is the church who has to take care of His people, and then Christ would reward His loyal servants for what they have done for Him and for His people and for His church. Right, back to the question, who is my neighbor? The church fathers point out that Christ is our neighbor who has loved us in spite of our rejection of His love, in spite of our rejection of His care and His concern. It is this inconceivable love of the incarnate Son of God for all of us, for you and for me, which is the greatest reason why we ought to love our neighbor, why we ought to love even our enemy. Oh yes, now to love is definitely difficult. To love is to sacrifice, to think less of self, to put our well-being after the well-being of another. I think the best example is the love of a mother, the love of a father for the child. As a child, I can never understand how much my parents love me. I think no child is able to understand how much the parents love the child until the child becomes a parent and loves their children endlessly. The parents' love for their child knows no bounds, and only then you realize, oh, that's how much my parents love me. And I think of the Samaritan man lying down, the Jewish man lying down there by the road. And the Samaritan man might have looked at him and thought, I'm going to help this man, but he also knew, he surely knew that if he were in the same place, most likely the Jewish man would not have helped him. But he did the great thing. He did the great action of love. He moved towards the Jewish man. And the movement is so significant because one must move towards other people in order to love them. In order to build relationships, one must move towards the other, even if the other is an enemy. Love doesn't just happen. Relationships are not built. You need to move towards another. I remember this one incident in my life. I got off the train. I was at Kandivali station. And at this station, I walked up the bridge and I saw a man lying down near a chair. And I thought to myself, this man might be drunk, might be just lying down, drunk and fallen down here. And I just went home. 3 hours I spent at home and I could not stop thinking of this man who was dead. So I decided, let me go back, at least for my own good conscience, let me go back and see. And when I went back there, I saw the man still lying down in the very same place. I was shocked. I felt that God had called me to actually help this person. So I went to this person. I searched him for a wallet. I searched him for a mobile. I could find neither. And then I realized that this man has been robbed, or he might have just lost it somewhere. And by that time, there were a few people who gathered around me to see what was happening. Another man helped me to search and found over there in his pocket a sheet of paper or a small booklet with a few phone numbers in that, and I called one of those numbers, and one of those numbers happened to be the number of his daughter. In a few moments his daughter arrived, the entire family arrived in a car, and they told me that this man was missing since the last few hours and they were unable to find him. They just went to the police to give a complaint about this missing man. And when I called them, they were so overjoyed that they found their father, they found a person that they loved. Now, I didn't actually love, or rather, I was compelled to love. But ever since that incident, ever since that day, I always pray to the Lord in prayer. I said, Lord, give me a heart of compassion. Give me a heart of love, a heart of pity, where I move towards another, where I move towards the other to share your love, to build relationships, even though it is not convenient. Right, back to the question. Who is my neighbor? In conclusion, I'd say this. By the fact that another person shares my humanity is enough to confer on that person the status of neighbor. Now, life throws different people together, and each encounter is a demand for love, is a demand for compassion. Why? For each and every person, you and me, we are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore the only adequate response to another person is love. No matter how great our differences, no matter which faith, which religion we are from, if there is no love, everything else becomes meaningless. I request you in your prayer, ask God to give you the grace to love. Ask God to give you the grace for compassion. Loving everyone is not easy, and therefore we need God's grace. We need God's help. We need God to lift us up from our path of going towards Jericho and put us back in Jerusalem. God bless. Amen. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, if you've learned something from this video, go ahead and share it with everyone. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until we see you again, Take care and God bless.